What happens when a boy born from a desperate prayer becomes the voice of a nation? What if God's plan for leadership didn't begin with a crown, but with a cradle and a calling in the night? From shattered hope to sovereign kings, this is the story of Samuel, the bridge between judges and monarchs, and the voice that anointed destiny. The first book of Samuel, the story of the last judge of Israel. In the days when the judges ruled over Israel, the nation was going through hard times. There was no king, and everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. The people often turned away from God, suffered the consequences, cried out for help, and the Lord would raise up a judge to deliver them. It was a cycle that repeated itself, over and over. It was during this turbulent time that a special boy was born, one who would become the last of the judges and the first great prophet after Moses. His name was Samuel, which means heard by God or asked of God. His story begins even before his birth, with a woman named Hannah who longed deeply to have a child. Through his mother's suffering and faith, Samuel came into the world as the answer to a heartfelt prayer and a vow made to God. His life would go on to change the course of Israel's history, marking the transition from the time of the judges to the beginning of the monarchy. In the hill country of Ephraim lived a man named Elkanah, who had 2 wives, as was customary in those days. One was named Hannah and the other Peninnah. Life was not easy for Hannah. While Peninnah had many children, Hannah had none. The first book of Samuel puts it plainly. Elkanah had 2 wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Not being able to have children at that time was seen as a great shame. People believed it was a sign of divine punishment. Hannah's sorrow came not only from her deep longing to be a mother, but also from the constant mocking and provocation she endured from Peninnah. Every year the family traveled to Shiloh to worship God and offer sacrifices. It should have been a joyful time, but for Hannah it only brought more pain. Her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Can you imagine how Hannah must have felt? Year after year, the same ridicule, the same pain, the same humiliation. Peninnah never missed a chance to remind her that she had no children. Each new baby Peninnah bore was a painful reminder of what was missing from Hannah's life. Elkanah, her husband, saw her sorrow and tried to comfort her. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Elkanah truly loved Hannah. He even gave her a double portion of the sacrifices to show she was special to him. But even the love of a devoted husband couldn't fill the emptiness in her heart. What she longed for was the joy of motherhood, to hold her own child in her arms. During the festival in Shiloh, while others feasted and celebrated, Hannah could barely eat. Tears streamed down her face, and the pain in her heart made it impossible to swallow. Her suffering ran so deep, it robbed her of even the simplest joys. Year after year, it was the same. Silent tears, biting words, and a hollow heart. But in that pain, something grew. A faith that would not give up. Hannah refused to stop believing that God could change her story. On one of those yearly trips to Shiloh, Hannah reached her breaking point. After the meal, while everyone else was still celebrating, she got up and went to the tabernacle to pray. Her heart was so heavy that she had to pour it out before God. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. Hannah didn't just sit in her sorrow. She brought it directly to God. Tears flowed freely as she poured out her soul in prayer. It wasn't a rehearsed or formal prayer, but the raw cry of a heart in pain. In that moment, Hannah made a solemn vow to God, and she made a vow saying, "Lord Almighty, If you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Hannah's vow revealed the depth of her heart. She wasn't asking for a son just to silence her shame or to prove something to Peninnah. She was ready to give back to God the very gift she longed for. If she had a son, he would be a Nazarite, someone wholly devoted to God's service for life. The uncut hair was a symbol of that special dedication. As she prayed, something unusual happened. Eli, the priest, was watching her. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. Hannah was so overcome with emotion that she prayed silently, her lips moving without sound. To Eli, it looked strange, like she was drunk. Imagine the scene. A woman crying, lips moving soundlessly, trembling with emotion. Eli jumped to the wrong conclusion. "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine," he said. What an awkward moment for Hannah. On top of all her pain, now she was being falsely accused. But Hannah responded with grace and dignity. "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli realized his mistake and changed his tone completely. Instead of rebuking her, he blessed her. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Those words brought hope to Hannah's heart. It was as if God himself was confirming through the priest that her prayer had been heard. She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Hannah walked away transformed. Hope had taken the place of despair. Even without yet knowing if she would have a child, she was no longer sad. Her face lit up again, and she had her appetite back. Her trust in God's goodness brought peace to her heart, even before the answer came. The next morning, Elkanah's family got up early. They worshiped the Lord one last time before heading back home to Ramah. Life returned to its usual rhythm. But for Hannah, something had changed. She carried a new hope. The Bible describes what happened next in a simple, straightforward way. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." Finally, after years of waiting and sorrow, Hannah was pregnant. Imagine the joy that filled her heart. The tears that once flowed from grief now streamed from pure happiness. Every little movement in her womb reminded her of the miracle God was working in her life. During those months of pregnancy, Hannah likely prepared everything with great care. She may have sewn tiny clothes, whispered to the baby in her belly, and told him stories about the God who had answered her prayer. She probably thought often about the promise she had made. She knew this child wouldn't be hers alone. He was to be dedicated to the Lord for his entire life. Then the day came. Hannah gave birth to a strong, healthy boy. As she looked at his little face, she chose a name rich with meaning. Samuel, a name that in Hebrew sounds like heard by God or asked of God. Every time she called his name, she'd remember the prayer that had been answered. Samuel's name wasn't just pretty or chosen from a list of family names. It was a living testimony of Hannah's faith and of God's faithfulness. "I asked the Lord for him," she said. Simple as that. An entire story of sorrow, prayer, and miracle, summed up in just a few words and in the name of her son. Elkanah the father must have been overjoyed at his son's birth. The whole family celebrated Samuel's arrival, recognizing him as a special gift from God. Even Peninnah, who had once mocked Hannah, could now see the divine favor resting on the one who had once been barren. Samuel grew strong and healthy. Hannah poured all her time and love into caring for him. She nursed him, rocked him to sleep, told him stories about the God of Israel, and began teaching him the first steps of faith. These days were precious to Hannah. She knew they wouldn't last forever. One day, she would have to fulfill her vow. When the time came for the annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, Elkanah prepared to go with the whole family, as he did every year. But this time, Hannah chose to stay behind. When Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." Anna wanted to make the most of the time she had with her son. She knew the moment of separation would come soon when she would give him over to serve the Lord at the tabernacle. Elkanah honored her decision. "Do what seems best to you. Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So little Samuel stayed home with his mother while the rest of the family made the yearly trip to offer sacrifices. Hannah cherished every moment with him, knowing that these days were fleeting and sacred. She was preparing not only his body, but also his heart for the purpose God had for him. Time passed quickly, and soon Samuel was old enough to be weaned. In that culture, children were often nursed much longer than today, possibly up to 3 years old. Hannah had made the most of every moment, but now it was time to keep her vow to the Lord. With a heart torn between the sorrow of parting and the joy of honoring her promise, Hannah made ready to take Samuel to Shiloh. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli. Imagine that moment, a mother bringing her young child along with generous offerings for the Lord. The 3-year-old bull, the large amount of flour, the skin of wine. These were valuable gifts reflecting Hannah's deep gratitude. This wasn't an obligation done reluctantly, but an act of sincere and joyful thankfulness. When she stood before Eli the priest, Hannah spoke with emotion. "Pardon me, my Lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." Can you picture this scene? Hannah, eyes full of tears, presenting her beloved son to the priest. Samuel, still small, perhaps puzzled by the moment, but sensing the love and the sacredness of it all. And Eli, realizing this was the same woman who had once poured out her soul before the Lord in anguish. For Hannah, giving Samuel over wasn't easy. He was her miracle, her answered prayer, her beloved son. But she understood that Samuel belonged first to God. She wasn't losing a child. She was returning to God what he had graciously given her. Eli received the child with solemnity, aware of the seriousness of Hannah's vow. Samuel would stay under his care, learning to serve in the tabernacle of the Lord. It was a great responsibility, but also a great honor to take in a child consecrated in this way. For Samuel, this was a major life change. Leaving the comfort of home, his parents' embrace, and the play of childhood to enter the sacred rhythms of tabernacle life, to trade toys for rituals, and begin learning the duties of serving God. But the Bible tells us they worshiped the Lord there. Even at a young age, Samuel was already beginning to understand something about God's presence. That final line says it all. And they worshiped the Lord there. In the midst of the pain of separation, there was worship. Hannah, Elkanah, and little Samuel bowed down before the Lord, acknowledging his goodness and faithfulness. It was a sacred moment, a moment where gratitude outweighed sorrow. Leaving Samuel in Shiloh was probably one of the hardest things Hannah ever did. Going home without him must have felt like leaving a piece of her heart behind, but she had peace, knowing her son was exactly where God wanted him to be. Even while feeling the pain of separation, Anna's heart overflowed with gratitude.
Right.
There in the tabernacle at Shiloh, she poured out her feelings in a prayer, so beautiful and profound that it was recorded in the Bible. It wasn't a lament over giving up her son. It was a song of praise to the God who hears prayers and transforms lives. Anna began her song like this: "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies. For I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God." Notice how Anna doesn't speak about her son, but about her God. She understood that Samuel's birth wasn't just a personal blessing. It was part of God's greater plan. Her joy wasn't merely about having a child. It came from knowing the power and faithfulness of the Lord. The song continues, "Do not keep talking so proudly or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away." These words reveal how Anna saw God's hand changing impossible situations. The strong are broken and the weak are made strong. The rich go hungry and the poor are fed. The barren woman bears children and the fertile one withers. Anna herself was living proof of God's transforming power. She goes on, "The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world." These words show a deep spiritual understanding. Anna acknowledges that God holds power over everything, life and death, poverty and riches. He owns the foundations of the earth, the Creator who sustains all things with his might. Anna's song ends with a vision of the future. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of music, darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. These closing words are especially powerful because Israel had no king at the time. In a way, Anna was speaking prophetically, hinting at the role her own son would one day play in history as the one who would anoint Israel's first king. Anna's song is not just a personal expression of gratitude. It reflects how deeply she understood God's character and his plans. Many scholars have noted how Anna's song resembles the Magnificat, the song Mary, the mother of Jesus, would sing centuries later. Both songs celebrate a God who lifts up the humble and does the impossible. After pouring out her praise with all her heart, Anna returned home to Ramah with her husband, leaving young Samuel in the care of Eli at the tabernacle. Even though she missed him, she had peace knowing her son was fulfilling the purpose he was born for. While Anna traveled back to Ramah, little Samuel stayed at the tabernacle in Shiloh. He was just a child, but he was already beginning to learn how to serve the Lord. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Imagine Samuel in that new environment. Everything was different from what he knew at home. The tabernacle was a sacred place full of rituals and responsibilities. There was the altar for sacrifices, the holy place with the table of the bread of the presence, the golden lampstand, and the altar of incense. And there was the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Samuel couldn't enter All those areas because he wasn't a priest. Only those from the family of Aaron, of the tribe of Levi, could serve in that role. Samuel was from the tribe of Ephraim, but he could help with the external duties of the tabernacle, the tasks that Eli the priest taught him. Despite being so young, Samuel had important responsibilities. Maybe he helped prepare the tabernacle for worship, organize the offerings. People brought or helped keep everything clean and in order. The Bible doesn't say exactly what he did, but it tells us that he ministered before the Lord. One notable detail about Samuel during this time was the clothes he wore. Samuel, though he was only a boy, ministered before the Lord, wearing a linen ephod. Each year, his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. The linen ephod was a priestly garment. Wearing it showed that even though he wasn't from Aaron's line, Samuel was dedicated to serving God. It was a visible sign of his consecration. And isn't it beautiful to see Anna's care? Even though she had left her son at the tabernacle, she never forgot him. Every year during the annual visit, she brought him a new robe. As the boy grew, the robe needed to grow too. It was a simple act of motherly love that reminded Samuel that even from afar, his mother was thinking of him and cared about his well-being. Those yearly visits must have been precious. Anna could see how her son was growing and learning to serve God. Samuel could hear news from home and feel the warmth of his family's love. Eli, witnessing this bond, would bless the family. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Anna. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. What a beautiful reward for Anna's faith. After years of infertility, after lending her firstborn to the Lord, she was blessed with 5 more children. And Samuel, who could have been an only child, now had brothers and sisters, even if he only saw them once a year. The verse ends by saying, "The boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord." Growing up in the Lord's presence meant more than just getting taller and stronger. It meant growing in wisdom, in the knowledge of God's ways, in understanding the scriptures and sacred rituals. Samuel wasn't just developing physically, he was growing spiritually. Samuel's childhood in the tabernacle was a time of preparation for the important role he would one day fulfill. There, under Eli's guidance, he learned about God's law, about the sacrificial system, and about how to listen to the voice of the Lord. Even though he was just a boy, Samuel was already being shaped to become a great man of God. But while Samuel was growing in the fear of the Lord, something tragic was happening right before his eyes. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, official priests of the tabernacle, were corrupting the worship of God with their awful behavior. The Bible doesn't mince words. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. That simple sentence revealed a deep problem. Hophni and Phinehas held sacred positions, but they had no respect for God or for the service they were supposed to perform. They saw the priesthood merely as a way to gain privileges and satisfy their own desires. Look at how they acted when people brought sacrifices to the Lord. Now, it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled and would plunge it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. According to the law of Moses, priests were entitled to a specific portion of the sacrifices. But Eli's sons invented their own system to take more than what was due. Instead of receiving the designated share, they would stick a fork into the pot and take whatever came out, often the choicest parts that were meant to be burned for the Lord. And it didn't stop there. Even before the fat was burned, The priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." If the man said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This was outrageous. In God's eyes, the fat of the animals was considered the best part, and according to the law, it had to be burned as an offering to the Lord. But Eli's sons would snatch the meat before the fat was burned, robbing God of what was rightfully his. And if anyone objected, they would threaten them with force. The Bible sums up the gravity of this sin. The sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight. For they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt, but their disrespect didn't end with the sacrifices. They also abused their position to satisfy sexual desires. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served. At the entrance to the tent of meeting, these women likely served the tabernacle in some religious function, perhaps helping with cleaning or preparing for the rituals. But Eli's sons, instead of honoring them as servants of God, treated them like objects for their own pleasure. When Eli found out, he tried to rebuke his sons. "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?" But his sons refused to listen to their father's warning, for the Lord had already decided to put them to death. Eli's words were right, but his attitude as a father and high priest was far too weak. He knew exactly what his sons were doing, yet he took no strong action to stop them. He merely scolded them without imposing any real discipline or consequences. This failure in leadership would have devastating consequences for his family and for all of Israel. God would send a prophet to declare judgment on Eli's household. As we later read in 1 Samuel 2:27-34, the sentence was harsh. Both of Eli's sons would die on the same day. None of the men in his family would live to old age, and the priesthood would be taken away from his lineage. What a contrast to the young Samuel. While Eli's sons, who should have been examples of godliness, were corrupting the worship of God, Samuel, still a boy, grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. He was being prepared to become the instrument God would use to bring spiritual renewal and reform to Israel. Now picture the tabernacle at night when everyone had gone to sleep. The lights were out except for the golden lampstand that was never to be extinguished. Eli, now old and nearly blind, was resting in his room. The young Samuel was lying down near the Ark of the Covenant inside the Lord's sanctuary. It was a night like any other, but it would change Samuel's life forever. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli's direction. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. The Bible makes a significant point by saying the word of the Lord was rare in those days. God wasn't speaking much to his people. That made what was about to happen even more extraordinary. Everything was quiet when all of a sudden the Lord called Samuel. Samuel. It was the voice of God. But Samuel had never heard God speak before. He thought it was Eli calling. So Samuel ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli saw that not call, "Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Samuel was obedient and eager to help. Even when woken in the middle of the night, he immediately ran to see what Eli needed. And when the priest told him he hadn't called, Samuel simply went back to bed without complaining. But soon it happened again. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel still didn't recognize the Lord's voice. The Bible explains, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." Imagine how confused the boy must have felt. He was certain someone was calling his name, yet Eli kept insisting it wasn't him. Still, Samuel went back to bed without protest. A third time the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." This third time something clicked for Eli, as someone experienced in the service of God. He realized what was happening. Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Eli gave Samuel specific instructions on how to respond if the voice called again. It was a turning point in the boy's life. God was about to reveal himself to Samuel in a deep and personal way. The Lord came and stood there calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel responded, just as Eli had instructed. He was ready to hear what God had to say. This was the beginning of his calling as a prophet of the Lord. The message God gave Samuel wasn't an easy one. It was a warning of judgment against Eli's household because of the sins of his sons and Eli's failure to discipline them. The Lord said to Samuel, "See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." It was a heavy message, especially for such a young boy. God was declaring that he would punish Eli's family due to the corruption of his sons and Eli's failure to correct them. The judgment would be so intense it would make people's ears tingle. Samuel lay in bed until morning, contemplating what had happened. Imagine how hard that must have been. His very first prophecy was a message of judgment against the man who raised him, mentored him, and was like a father to him in the tabernacle. Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision. As the day began, Samuel got up and opened the tabernacle doors as usual, but he was afraid. How could he deliver such a difficult message to Eli? How would the priest react? Would he be angry, punish Samuel? The boy was likely anxious and nervous. But Eli wanted to know what the Lord had said. So Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it he said to you?" Eli asked, "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." Eli's response shows acceptance and humility. He didn't get angry with Samuel. He didn't reject the message or try to justify his actions. He simply accepted God's judgment, acknowledging his sovereignty. He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. Samuel was just beginning his journey as a prophet. The Bible says Samuel grew up and the Lord was with him, and let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. This final part sums up the outcome of Samuel's nighttime calling. He grew not only in age but also in his walk with God. The Lord was with him, affirming his word so that none of his prophecies failed. From the northernmost point to the southern tip of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, Everyone recognized that Samuel was a true prophet chosen and anointed by God. Most importantly, God continued to reveal himself to Samuel. That first night, when God called him by name, was just the beginning of a life of deep communion with the Lord. Samuel, the boy born in response to a desperate prayer, was now growing into the answer to a nation's desperate need. In a time of spiritual darkness when the word of the Lord was rare, God raised up a young prophet to be his voice to the people. Samuel would become the last of the judges and the first great prophet after Moses, bridging two important eras in Israel's history. After that special night when God first called him, Samuel grew in wisdom and stature. He was no longer just a boy serving in the tabernacle. He was now a young man chosen by God to deliver his word to the people. The revelation about Eli's household was only the beginning. God kept speaking and Samuel kept listening. In the E-verse book of Samuel 3, Es 2:1-4-1, we read, "The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel. Through his word and Samuel's word came to all Israel." God not only spoke to Samuel, but used the young man to deliver messages to all the people of Israel, from the north to the south of the country. Everyone knew that there was a true prophet among them. In chapter 3:19, the Bible tells us, "The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground." What made Samuel different was that his prophecies always came to pass. Not a single word of his was wasted. When he said, "This is what the Lord says," people knew they could trust him. Just imagine how important that was at the time. For years, the word of the Lord was rare. As the Bible itself tells us, the people lived without clear guidance from God. The priests, who were supposed to be spiritual leaders, were corrupt. Eli was old and weak, and his sons were wicked. It was a time of spiritual darkness. And then Samuel emerged, a young man with a fresh message from heaven. People came from far away to hear him. Tribal leaders sought him out for counsel. Little by little, Samuel was becoming much more than just a servant in the tabernacle. He was becoming a judge, someone who guided the people not only spiritually, but also politically. In chapter 3:20, the Bible declares, "And all Israel from Dan to Beba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord, from the northernmost city, Dan, to the southernmost Beersheba. Every Israelite knew God had raised up a new leader for his people." Samuel didn't seek this position. He didn't campaign to be recognized. It was God who established him, opening the doors and confirming his word. And the people naturally accepted his leadership because they saw in him not just an eloquent man, but someone through whom God truly spoke. Samuel's transition from a simple tabernacle servant to a national prophet didn't happen overnight. It took years. He grew in wisdom and in authority in the eyes of the people. More importantly, he grew in intimacy with God. The Lord didn't just speak to him occasionally. He built a continuous relationship of communication with him. Samuel's formative years in the tabernacle were not in vain. There beside the Ark of the Covenant, he learned about the traditions, the laws, and the sacred rituals of Israel. Now, all that knowledge was being used by God to guide the people back into right relationship with their Creator. When Samuel spoke, the people listened. When he gave counsel, they followed, not because he was an imposed ruler, but because he was recognized as a true messenger of God. That authority would soon be tested in a way no one could have foreseen. The Philistines were long-standing enemies of Israel. They lived along the Mediterranean coast and frequently invaded Israelite territory, plundering villages and asserting their dominance. For years, they had been a thorn in Israel's side. And now they were back, stronger and more determined than ever. In 1 Samuel 4:1, we read, "The Philistines assembled to fight against Israel." The tension between the two peoples finally erupted into open war. We don't know exactly how it began. Perhaps the Philistines invaded Israelite land. Perhaps Israel tried to throw off Philistine oppression. Either way, the armies gathered for battle. Israel camped near Ebenezer while the Philistines set up camp at AFK. These locations lay between the mountains of Israel and the coastal plain of the Philistines, a natural battlefield between the two territories. The clash was imminent. With their shields gleaming in the sun, their swords sharp and their hearts full of courage, the Israelite soldiers marched into combat. Perhaps they thought God would give them an easy victory. After all, weren't they His chosen people? Didn't they have the Lord of hosts on their side? But chapter 4-2 tells us what really happened. The Philistines fought and the Israelites were defeated. About 4,000 of them were killed on the battlefield. 4,000 men, 4,000 husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return home. It was a crushing defeat. Picture the scene in the Israelite camp after the battle. Wounded soldiers groaning in pain. Commanders scrambling to regroup the remaining forces, and one question echoing through everyone's mind. Why? Why did God let us be defeated? The elders of Israel gathered to discuss the disaster. They were confused and desperate. In verse 3 of that same chapter, they asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines?" The answer they came up with seemed logical at the time, but it revealed a shallow understanding of their relationship with God. Still in verse 3, they said, "Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." Instead of turning to God in repentance, they chose to use the ark like a magic charm, as if the mere presence of the sacred object could guarantee victory. The Ark of the Covenant was Israel's most sacred item, a gold-covered wooden chest that held the tablets of the law given to Moses, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff. On top of it stood 2 golden cherubim, and between them, God's presence was said to dwell. It was the most powerful symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. In verse 4 we read, "So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim." And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. When the Ark arrived at the camp, the people erupted in joy. Verse 5 says, "When the Ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook." It was as if victory were already assured. With God literally in their midst, or so they believed, how could they lose? The Philistines heard the Israelite celebration and grew afraid. They were familiar with the stories about the God of Israel, how He had delivered His people from Egypt through mighty plagues and miracles. In verse 8, they exclaimed, "Woe to us who will deliver us from the hands of these mighty gods." These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. But despite their fear, the Philistine leaders rallied their troops. In verse 9, they commanded, "Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews, just as they have been to you. Be men and fight." The second round of battle was about to begin. The next day, the armies lined up once more for combat. On one side stood the Philistines, determined to fight to the end despite their fear. On the other side, the Israelites stood confident, trusting in the presence of the ark among them. At the center of Israel's line stood Hophni and Phinehas, the corrupt sons of Eli, guarding the sacred ark. Trumpets sounded, war cries filled the air, and the armies surged toward one another. Swords clashed against shields, arrows hissed through the air, and dust rose from the battlefield as men fought and fell. In 1 Samuel 4:10, we read the devastating result. So the Philistines fought and the Israelites were defeated. Every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers, 30,000 men. It was an unprecedented disaster. And verse 11 brings the worst news of all. The Ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Uni and Phinehas, died. Not only was the battle lost, but the most sacred object in all of Israel, the symbol of God's presence among his people, had been captured by pagan enemies. And Eli's sons, just as God had prophesied, died on the same day. Imagine the scene. Philistine soldiers surrounding the captured ark, perhaps even touching it with unclean hands, mocking the God of Israel. Some may have hesitated recalling the stories of the Hebrew God's power, but victory gave them confidence. After all, if the God of Israel were truly so powerful, why had he allowed his ark to be taken? The bodies of Hophni and Phinehas lay on the battlefield, fulfilling the judgment God had pronounced against Eli's house. Those who had defiled the sacred sacrifices and abused their positions for personal gain were now dead, unable to continue their corruption. For the surviving Israelite soldiers, it was a desperate retreat. They fled back to their homes, defeated and humiliated. How would they explain this tragedy to their families? How could they tell them that the Ark of God had been taken? One man from the tribe of Benjamin ran from the battlefield straight to Shiloh. In verse 12, we read that he arrived with his clothes torn and dust on his head, traditional signs of mourning and grief. The entire city soon knew that something terrible had occurred. In verse 13, the Bible tells us, when he arrived, Eli was sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching because his heart feared for the Ark of God. This messenger carried news that would forever change the religious life of Israel. He didn't know it, but his words would fulfill a prophecy spoken years earlier to a boy who had heard the voice of God in the night. Eli was seated in his chair by the gate of Shiloh. At 98 years old, blind and heavy, the old priest anxiously waited for news of the battle. It wasn't so much the outcome of the war that troubled him. It was the fate of the Ark of the Covenant that made his heart tremble. In 1 Samuel 4:13, we read, "When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town cried out." Imagine the cries and wails echoing through the streets of Shiloh, women fearing for their husbands and sons, children confused and terrified, elders foreseeing difficult times ahead. In verse 14, the Bible says, Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" May, even without sight, his experienced ears recognized that something terrible had happened. The messenger ran to Eli to deliver the news firsthand. In verse 16 we read, "The man said to Eli, 'I have just come from the battle line. I fled from it this very day.' Eli asked, 'What happened, my son?' Then came the report, a fourfold catastrophe, each part worse than the last. In verse 17 he said, 'Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered a great defeat. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured.' When Eli heard about the Ark, his response was immediate and fatal. In verse 18 we read, "As soon as he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had led Israel for 40 years. In a moment, the man who had served as Israel's high priest for 4 decades was dead. It wasn't the news of Israel's defeat that killed him, not even the deaths of his two sons. It was the capture of the Ark of God that broke his heart. For all his failures as a father, Eli genuinely loved the Lord and held deep reverence for the sanctity of the Ark. The thought that the sacred symbol of God's presence among his people was now in the hands of pagan Philistines was more than his old heart could bear. And the tragedy of Eli's family didn't end there. In verse 19, the Bible tells us his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the Ark of God had been captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As the midwives tried to comfort her, telling her she had given birth to a son, her response was one of utter sorrow. In verses 21 and 22, we read, "But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy cod, saying, The glory has departed from Israel because the ark of God had been captured and because of the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Ichabod means no glory. What a sad name for a child, yet it perfectly captured the mood in Israel at that moment. The glory had indeed departed. The most sacred object of Israelite worship was in enemy hands. The high priest was dead. The Philistines held military dominance. It was one of the darkest times in Israel's history. With the death of Eli and his sons and the capture of the ark, a chapter in Israel's story came to a close. The religious leadership from Eli's lineage had ended, just as God had prophesied to Samuel years before. Now the young Samuel, already recognized as a prophet, would also become Israel's new spiritual leader. While Israel mourned, the Philistines celebrated. They had defeated their enemy and captured the most sacred symbol of Israelite religion. As a war trophy, they brought the ark to Ashdod, one of their 5 major cities, and placed it in the temple of their god Dion. In 1 Samuel 5:1-2, we read, "After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dion's temple and set it beside Dion." Dion was the main god of the Philistines, often depicted as half man, half fish. Placing the ark beside Dion's statue was their way of saying, "Our God has defeated the God of Israel." It was a deliberate insult to the true God. But the next morning, the Philistines got an unpleasant surprise. "Come down and take it up to your town." And thus the ark went to the house of Abinadab in Kiriath-Jearim, where it would remain for many years. So ended the ark's captivity among the Philistines. The sacred object was back in Israel. But the nation's religious and political life still needed restoration. That would be Samuel's task in the years ahead. For 20 long years, the ark stayed in the house of Abinadab in Kiriath-Jearim. During this time, Samuel grew not just in age, but in influence. With Eli gone and the ark removed from the tabernacle in Shiloh, Samuel became the undisputed spiritual leader of Israel. In 1 Samuel 7-2, we read, "Then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord." This verse tells us that for 2 decades, Israel had lived in a kind of spiritual darkness. Perhaps they still worshipped other gods. Or maybe they had simply lost faith in the Lord after their defeat by the Philistines. But something was changing in the nation's heart. Samuel saw that it was time to act. The people were ready for a spiritual renewal, a true return to the God of their ancestors. So in verse 3, he addressed them with authority. "If you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and the Ashtaroths, and commit yourselves to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines." Samuel's calling was clear and direct. True repentance required concrete action. It wasn't enough for the people to simply say they wanted to return to God. They had to abandon their idols, the foreign gods, especially Ashtaroth, the fertility goddess worshipped by neighboring peoples. To our surprise, the people responded positively. In verse 4, the Bible tells us, "So the Israelites put away their Baals and Ashtaroths and served the Lord only." They were truly willing to change, to turn from false gods and follow the Lord exclusively. Seeing this positive response, Samuel took a step further. He called for a national assembly. In verse 5 we read, "Then Samuel said, 'Assemble all Israel at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you.'" Mizpah was a strategic location, a city in the hills, visible from afar. It was the perfect place for a nationwide gathering. And the people came from all the tribes from every corner of the land of Israel. They gathered at Mizpah. It wasn't a forced summons, but a voluntary response to the prophet's call. They genuinely wanted to reconcile with God. At Mizpah, the people demonstrated their repentance in concrete and public ways. In verse 6, the Bible records, "On that day they fasted, and there they confessed, 'We have sinned against the Lord.'" Fasting was a sign of mourning and repentance. It showed they were truly grieved over their sins and for having abandoned the Lord. And their confession wasn't vague or generic. They said plainly, "We have sinned against the Lord." They recognized that their actions weren't just cultural mistakes or minor failings. They were sins against the living God. They didn't shift the blame or make excuses, but took full responsibility for their actions. Samuel seized this moment of spiritual sensitivity to lead the people. Still in verse 6 we read, "Now Samuel was serving as leader of Israel at Mizpah." This is the first time the Bible clearly refers to Samuel as a judge. He was not only speaking God's word as a prophet, but also judging Israel's affairs and leading them politically. But news of the Israelite gathering at Mizpah soon reached the Philistines. Perhaps they feared that this large assembly was actually a rebellion in the making. In verse 7, the Bible tells us, "When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them." When the Israelites heard it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. The Israelites still remembered the terrible defeat from years earlier when 30,000 men died in a single day. They were terrified at the thought of facing the Philistines again. That's why in verse 8, they turned to Samuel for help. They said to Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines." Notice the difference compared to the past. The last time they faced the Philistines, they brought out the Ark of the Covenant, treating it like a magic talisman. Now they asked Samuel to pray for them. They weren't trusting in sacred objects anymore. They were seeking divine intervention. Through the prayer of a man of God, Samuel responded to the people's plea. In verse 9 we read, "Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him." The lamb's sacrifice symbolized Israel's total dependence on God's mercy. A burnt offering where the entire animal was consumed represented complete devotion to the Lord. God's answer came swiftly. In verse 10, the Bible reports, "While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites." God intervened in a powerful and supernatural way. A deafening thunder, possibly with lightning and storm, caused panic among the Philistine army. The victory didn't come from Israel's military strength, but from God's direct intervention. Seeing the enemy in disarray, the Israelites shifted from defense to offense. In verse 11, we read, "The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Bethar." The same people who had just been trembling with fear now courageously pursued their enemies. It's amazing how trusting in God can turn fear into boldness. To commemorate this extraordinary victory, Samuel did something significant. In 1 Samuel 7:12, we read, "Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, saying, 'Thus far the Lord has helped us.'" Enir means stone of help. It was a simple monument, a single stone, but it carried deep meaning. It was a visible and lasting reminder that God had helped his people. Interestingly, it was near Ebenezer that Israel had suffered a terrible defeat years earlier. Chapter 4-1. Now that same place had witnessed a great victory. The name Ebenezer also carried a message of humility and hope. Samuel said, "Thus far, the Lord has helped us." It was an acknowledgement that all their help came from God, not from military power or human wisdom. And it implied that God's help would continue into the future. The same God who had helped them so far would keep helping them. The defeat of the Philistines was so decisive that they couldn't recover for quite some time. In verse 13, the Bible says, "So the Philistines were subdued, and they stopped invading Israel's territory." Throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. That doesn't mean there were never any more conflicts with the Philistines. We know they would still be enemies of Israel in the days of Saul and David. But for a long period, throughout Samuel's leadership, they were kept in check, unable to dominate Israel as they had in the past. Even better, the Israelites managed to recover territories they had previously lost to the Philistines. In verse 14 we read, "The towns the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel from Ekron to Gath, and Israel delivered the surrounding territory from the power of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites." This verse shows us the extent of the victory. Not only were the Philistines defeated in battle, but Israel also reclaimed cities and lands that had been captured. Ekron and Gath were two of the 5 main Philistine cities. The territory between them, essentially the entire coastal plain of Philistia, was returned to Israelite control. And it didn't stop there. Peace extended beyond the Philistines, reaching the Amorites as well, another people who frequently clashed with Israel. The victory at Ebenezer had a ripple effect, influencing Israel's relationships with other neighboring peoples. With peace secured, Samuel could now focus on his role as judge. In verse 15, the Bible states, "Samuel continued as judge over Israel all the days of his life." He wasn't a king, nor did he command a standing army. His authority came from the respect people had for him as a prophet and representative of God. Samuel's leadership style was itinerant. He didn't sit in a palace waiting for the people to come to him. Instead, he traveled throughout the country, ensuring that justice was accessible to everyone. Verse 16 tells us from year to year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah were strategically located cities. By visiting them regularly, Samuel ensured that even those who lived far from his home base had access to justice. It was a decentralized judicial system, one that brought the judge to the people rather than forcing the people to travel long distances. Verse 3 tells us, "When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dean fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dean and put him back in his place." Imagine the shock of Dean's priests finding the deity toppled over as if bowing before the ark of Israel's God. They quickly set the statue back up, perhaps trying to cover up the incident. Maybe they claimed it was an accident, an unstable base, or even an earthquake. But the next morning, the message was unmistakable. Verse 4 says, "But the following morning when they rose, there was Deon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. This time, there was no room for excuses. It wasn't an accident. The statue hadn't merely fallen. It had been decapitated and dismembered, a clear symbol of defeat and humiliation. The God of the Philistines was being shamed by the true God, and that was just the beginning. Soon the people of Ashdod began suffering from a mysterious and painful disease. In verse 6 we read, "The Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation on them and afflicted them with tumors." These tumors, or hemorrhoids, according to some translations, were extremely painful and spread rapidly among the population. People began to connect this outbreak with the presence of the Ark of the God of Israel in their city. In desperation, Ashdod's leaders decided the Ark had to go. Verse 7 says, "When the people of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, 'The Ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us because his hand is heavy on us and on Deon, our God.' They summoned the 5 Philistine rulers to decide what to do next. Verse 8 tells us, "So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, 'What shall we do with the Ark of the God of Israel?' They answered, 'Have the Ark of the God of Israel moved to Gath? So they moved the ark of the God of Israel, but the problem only relocated. The same plague struck the city of Gath. In verse 9, we read, "But after they had moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into a great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. The people of Gath, now just as desperate, sent the ark to Ekron, another Philistine city. But as the ark approached, panic erupted." Verse 10 says, "As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, 'They have brought the ark of the God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people.' And sure enough, the same plague struck Ekron with full force." Verses 11 and 12 read, "So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, 'Send the ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people.' For death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy on it. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. For 7 months, the ark went from city to city among the Philistines, bringing plague and death wherever it went. The Philistines had captured the ark, thinking they had defeated the God of Israel. Now they were learning the hard way that the true God could not be captured or controlled. He was displaying his power in the midst of his people's enemies. After 7 months of suffering, the Philistines were desperate to get rid of the ark. Their cities were being devastated by disease, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the God of Israel was punishing them for seizing this sacred object. In 1 Samuel 6:12, we read, "When the ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory 7 months, the Philistines called for the priests and the divers and said, 'What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to its place.' The Philistine priests and divers knew they couldn't just send it back empty. They needed to appease the wrath of Israel's God with some kind of offering. In verse 3, they explain, "If you return the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. By all means, send a guilt offering to him, then you will be healed, and you will know why his hand has not been lifted from you." When asked what kind of offering they should send, they gave a specific answer. In verses 4 and 5 they said, 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers, because the same plague struck both you and your rulers. Make models of the tumors and of the rats that are ravaging the land, and give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will lift his hand from you and your gods and your land." This offering, though strange to modern eyes, made sense within the ancient mindset. The gold tumors represented the disease that afflicted them, and the gold rats likely symbolized a plague of rodents destroying their fields, or possibly even the carriers of the disease itself. By sending golden replicas of the sources of their suffering, the Philistines hoped that the God of Israel would take away the real ones. The Philistine priests also recalled what had happened to the Egyptians when they resisted God. In verse 6 they warned, "Why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When God dealt harshly with them, did they not send the Israelites out so they could go on their way?" They didn't want to make the same mistake and risk suffering even worse plagues. So they made preparations to return the ark. In verses 7 and 8, they instructed, "Now then, get a new cart ready with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pen them up. Take the ark of the Lord and put it on the cart, and in a chest beside it, put the gold objects you are sending back to him as a guilt offering. Send it on its way." This was an interesting test. Cows that are nursing calves would not normally walk away from them. If the cows, against their natural instinct, carried the ark to Israelite territory without being led, it would be a clear sign that the hand of the God of Israel was directing the events. In verse 9, they explained their reasoning. "Watch it. Go. If it goes up to its own territory toward Beth-Emesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it does not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us, but that it happened to us by chance." The Philistines followed the plan precisely. They placed the ark and the gold objects on the cart, shut the calves in the barn, and released the cows. What happened next was remarkable. In verse 12 we read, "Then the cows went straight up toward Beth-Shemesh, keeping on the road and looing all the way. They did not turn to the right or the left. The rulers of the Philistines followed them as far as the border of Beth-Shemesh. Against their natural instinct to return to their calves, the cows walked straight into Israelite territory. There was no driver steering the cart, no Philistine guiding the animals. It was the God of Israel himself who was bringing his ark home. At that moment, the people of Bethshemesh were harvesting wheat in the valley. When they looked up and saw the ark, they rejoiced." In verse 14, the Bible says, "The cart came to the field of Joshua of Beth-Shemesh, and there it stopped beside a large rock. The people chopped up the wood of the cart and sacrificed the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites, who were responsible for caring for the ark, according to the law of Moses, took down the sacred object and the chest with the gold items and placed them on the large rock. The people of Beth-Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrifices to the Lord that day, celebrating the ark's return. When the 5 Philistine rulers saw all of this, they returned to Ekron that same day. Their experience with the ark of the Lord was over. They had learned the hard way that the God of Israel was more powerful than their idols and could not be treated as a mere war trophy. But not everyone in Beth-Shemesh treated the ark with proper reverence. Some, driven by curiosity, looked inside the ark, something strictly forbidden, even for the Levites. In verse 19, we read, "But God struck down some of the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death, because they looked into the ark of the Lord. The people mourned because of the heavy blow the Lord had dealt them, shaken by this demonstration of God's holiness. The people of Beth-Shemesh asked, as recorded in verse 20, 'Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here?' So they sent messengers to the people of Kiriath-Jearim, saying, as in verse 21, 'The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord.' But Samuel did have a home, a place to which he always returned. In verse 17, the Bible says, 'But he always went back to Ramah where his home was, and there he also held court for Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord.' Ramah was Samuel's base of operations, where he built an altar to the Lord. This shows that even though the ark was in Kiriath-Jearim and the tabernacle in Shiloh may have been destroyed, the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 26-6 suggests that Shiloh was destroyed possibly by the Philistines after the ark was captured. The worship of God continued. Samuel kept true worship alive, connecting the people to their God through sacrifices and religious festivals. Samuel marked a new era for Israel. After the disaster of the ark's capture and the death of Eli, he restored the connection between God and his people. Through his leadership, Israel experienced spiritual revival, victory over enemies, and a season of peace and prosperity. Samuel's success didn't come from personal talent, though he was undoubtedly a capable man, but from his faithfulness to the Lord. He called the people back to God, led them in genuine repentance, and placed complete trust in divine power for victory. The stone of Ebenezer stood as a symbol of that simple yet profound truth. Thus far, the Lord has helped us. Samuel was the last of the judges, closing an era in Israel's history that began with Enilael after Joshua's death. But he was also the first of the prophets, beginning a new tradition of men who boldly spoke God's word to the people. And soon he would be the one chosen to usher in yet another era, the monarchy in Israel. Years passed and Samuel, the faithful prophet and judge of Israel, began to feel the weight of age. His once dark hair had turned gray. The hands that had often been raised in prayer now trembled slightly. His eyes, which had seen so many of God's miracles, no longer saw as clearly. In 1 Samuel 8:1, the Bible tells us, "When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel." It was a natural decision. Samuel could no longer travel throughout all of Israel as he once had. He needed help in judging the people's cases. And who better than his own sons, who had grown up witnessing his example of justice and faithfulness to God? Verse 2 tells us, "The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba." Beba was in the far south of Israel, an important place, almost a gateway to the Negev desert. Placing his sons there showed that Samuel trusted them to handle significant cases. He likely hoped they would follow in his footsteps, judging with fairness and reverence for God. But something went terribly wrong. Verse 3 brings a sad revelation. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. What a heartbreak for Samuel. After a lifetime of serving God with integrity, his own sons chose a different path. They did not inherit their father's character. Where Samuel served the people, they exploited them. Where Samuel sought justice, they sought profit. Where Samuel resisted temptation, they gave in to bribes. News of their corruption quickly spread. The people began to murmur. Those with legal disputes in Beersheba knew they would not receive fair treatment unless they had money to bribe Samuel's sons. The poor and vulnerable, those most in need of justice, were the ones least likely to receive it. Interestingly, this story echoes what happened with Eli, the priest who raised Samuel. His sons Hophni and Phinehas also became corrupt and abused their positions. Samuel had seen the consequences of that, the deaths of Eli's sons and the judgment upon his household. And yet, he could not prevent his own sons from walking a similar path. The situation became so dire that Israel's leaders had to act. They couldn't allow corrupt judges to continue. Decisions involving property, disputes, and even criminal matters were being swayed by money, not truth. How could a people meant to reflect God's justice tolerate such a thing? The situation with Samuel's sons led the leaders of Israel to make a radical decision. In chapter 8-4 we read, "So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah." Picture the scene. The elders of the tribes respected men in their communities, traveling together to Ramah, the town where Samuel lived. They were united and determined. They had an important request to make. When they stood before Samuel, they got straight to the point. Verse 5 tells us, "They said to him, 'You are old and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us such as all the other nations have.'" This request hit Samuel like an arrow. It was true that he was growing old, and it was also true that his sons were not good judges, but the solution they proposed, a king like the other nations, felt wrong to him. In verse 6, we see Samuel's reaction. But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. Why was Samuel displeased? Perhaps because he saw the request not just as a rejection of his leadership or of his sons, but of the entire system of judges that God had established. Maybe because he knew that the kings of surrounding nations were often tyrants who oppressed their own people. Or maybe because he sensed that the Israelites were more interested in being like the other nations than in being God's special people. As he always did in difficult moments, Samuel brought the issue before God in prayer. And God in his wisdom gave Samuel a surprising perspective. In verses 7 and 8, the Lord responds, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you." God helped Samuel see that the problem went deeper than a matter of governance. It was a spiritual issue. The people weren't just rejecting the judge system. They were rejecting God as their true king. They were following a pattern of rebellion that had begun when they were freed from Egypt. God then told Samuel what to do. In verse 9 he says, "Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." Faithful to the Lord S'word, Samuel returned to the elders of Israel and laid out in detail what life under a king would look like. It wouldn't be all ease and luxury. In verses 11 to 117, Samuel explains how the king would take their sons for his army, their daughters to serve in his palace, the best of their land for himself, and he would impose heavy taxes. He ends with a grim warning in verse 18, "When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." It was a clear and serious warning. Samuel was essentially saying, think carefully about what you're asking for. A human king will take much from you and give little in return. And when regret comes, it may be too late. But the people refused to listen. In verse 19, we read their response. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us." And they continued in verse 20, "Then we will be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." Two motivations are clear in this response. First, they wanted to be like all the other nations. They seemed tired of being different, of being God's chosen people with unique laws and customs. They wanted to fit in, to blend in. Second, they wanted someone to fight our battles. Perhaps they were tired of relying on God's protection, which sometimes required faith and obedience. A human king with a standing army felt like a more tangible, immediate solution. Samuel listened to all they said and brought it back to the Lord. And God's answer in verse 22 was simple and direct. Listen to them and give them a king. A new chapter in Israel's history was about to begin. The era of the judges was coming to a close, and the era of kings was just about to start. When God decides to act, even the most ordinary events can become extraordinary. In Saul's case, it all began with some lost donkeys. In chapter 9 verse 3 we read, "Now the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, 'Take one of the servants with you and go and look for the donkeys.'" A simple, ordinary task. Saul probably didn't imagine that this donkey hunt would change his life forever. He and his servant searched through hills and valleys, but found no sign of the animals. After a long search, they were ready to give up. In verse 5, Saul says, "Come, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start worrying about us." But the servant had another idea. In verse 6, he suggests, "Look, in this town there is a man of God. He is highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take." They were speaking of Samuel, though they didn't mention him by name. The servant knew of a man of God in the city who might be able to help. Saul hesitated. They had no gift to offer the seer. But the servant said he had a bit of silver, and that would be enough. So they decided to go seek out the man of God. What Saul didn't know was that God had already spoken to Samuel about him. In verse 15, Scripture tells us, "Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel." And in verse 16, God says, "About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me." This shows how God was working behind the scenes. The donkeys weren't lost by accident. The servant's suggestion wasn't mere coincidence. Everything was part of God's plan to bring Saul to Samuel. When Saul and his servant entered the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water and asked them about Samuel. The girls told them he had just arrived for a sacrifice ceremony and that they should hurry if they wanted to catch him before he went up to eat with the guests. And then in verse 17, something surprising happens. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Imagine Samuel's shock. There stood the man God had chosen to be the first king of Israel. He wasn't a famous warrior or a well-known leader. He was just a young man out looking for some lost donkeys. But God sees what people cannot. He looks at the heart. Saul approached Samuel at the gate and asked where he could find the seer. Samuel replied, "I am the seer. Go up ahead of me to the high place, for today you are to eat with me. In the morning I will send you on your way and tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them. They have been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line?" This answer must have stunned Saul. How did the seer know about the lost donkeys? And what did he mean by all the desire of Israel? Confused, Saul responded in verse 21, "But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" Saul couldn't understand what was happening. He saw himself as insignificant, belonging to the smallest tribe from the least important clan. How could all the desire of Israel be directed at him? But Samuel didn't offer more explanation at that moment. Instead, he took Saul and his servant to the place of sacrifice, gave them seats of honor among the guests, and served Saul the best portion of the meat. Later, Samuel brought Saul to his home and spoke with him on the rooftop. The next morning, as Saul prepared to leave, Samuel asked him to serve on ahead. He had something important to say, something that would change not only Saul's life, but the course of Israel's history. With the servant gone, Samuel and Saul were alone. It was time to reveal the true purpose behind what seemed like a chance encounter. In chapter 10-1, we read, "Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, 'Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance?'" Imagine Saul's shock. He had left home looking for donkeys, and now he was being anointed as king of Israel. The oil flowing down his head was a symbol of God's Spirit coming upon him, empowering him for the great task ahead. To confirm that this was truly from God, Samuel gave Saul 3 signs that would happen on his way back home. First, he would meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb who would tell him the donkeys had been found. Next, he would meet 3 men going up to worship at Bethel, and they would offer him 2 loaves of bread. Finally, he would encounter a group of prophets, and the Spirit of God would come upon him powerfully, causing him to prophesy among them. Samuel ended with an important instruction in verse 7. "Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you." And in verse 8, he added, "Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." Everything happened exactly as Samuel had said. When Saul met the group of prophets, the Spirit of God came on him powerfully, and he began to prophesy with them. People who knew him were amazed. In verse 11, they asked, "What is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" That experience changed Saul. Verse 9 tells us, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. God was preparing Saul for his new role as king, transforming him from the inside out. Meanwhile, Samuel gathered all the people of Israel at Mizpah. It was time to make public what had taken place in private. In verse 18, Samuel reminded the people how God had rescued them from Egypt and from all the kingdoms that had oppressed them. Then in verse 19, he confronted them. "But you have now rejected your God who saves you out of all your disasters and calamities, and you have said, 'No, appoint a king over us." It was a solemn reminder that by asking for a king, they were in a way rejecting God as their true king. But as God had commanded, Samuel proceeded with the process of selecting the king. The tribes were brought forward, and the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. Then the clan of Matri was selected. Finally, from that family, Saul son of Kish was chosen. It was a public confirmation of the private choice God had already made. But when they looked for Saul, they couldn't find him. In verse 22, they had to inquire of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord replied, "Yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies." Picture the scene. The man chosen to be king was hiding among the baggage. Perhaps out of humility, perhaps out of fear of the responsibility Saul was trying to run from. His destiny. But you can't hide from a divine calling. The people ran and brought Saul out. And as he stood among the assembly, he stood a head taller than everyone else. Verse 23 says, "He stood among the people, and he was a head taller than any of the others." Then Samuel said to the people, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There's no one like him among all the people." And the people shouted, "Long live the king." Samuel explained the rights and duties of kingship to the people, wrote them down on a scroll, and placed it before the Lord. Then he dismissed everyone to their homes. Saul also returned to his home in Giah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched, but not everyone was pleased. In verse 27 we read, "But some scoundrel said, 'How can this fellow save us?' They despised him and brought him no gifts. But Saul kept silent. And so began the reign of Saul, the first king of Israel, anointed in secret, confirmed in public, admired by some, rejected by others. Time would tell whether he would be the king Israel truly needed." With Saul now established as king, Samuel knew that his role as judge was coming to an end. It was time to officially say goodbye and pass on the mantle of leadership. After Saul proved his worth by defeating the Ammonites, Samuel saw it as the perfect moment. In chapter 12-1, we read, "Samuel said to all Israel, 'I have listened to everything you said to me, and have set a king over you.'" Samuel was formally acknowledging that the transition was complete. The people had asked for a king, and God had granted their request through Samuel. Samuel went on to remind the people that he had been their leader for many years from his youth. In verse 2, he says, "Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I'm old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day." Before stepping away entirely, Samuel wanted to clear his name. In verse 3, he asked the people an important question. "Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to turn a blind eye? If I have done any of these things, I will make it right." It was a bold question. Samuel was challenging anyone he may have wronged to speak up. If he had taken someone's property, judged unfairly, or accepted bribes, now was the time to say it. The people's response in verse 4 was unanimous. "You have not cheated or oppressed." "Us," they said. "You have not taken anything from anyone's hand." And Samuel pressed further. "The Lord is witness against you, and also his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand." And the people confirmed, "He is witness." This public affirmation of Samuel's integrity is striking. After so many years as judge, no one could accuse him of corruption or injustice. A sharp contrast to his sons who accepted bribes and perverted justice. With his name cleared, Samuel took the opportunity to give the people a history lesson. In verses 6-11, he reminds them how God had brought the Israelites out of Egypt, how they had often forgotten him, how God had allowed their enemies to oppress them when they strayed, and how he sent judges to deliver them when they cried out for help. It was a reminder that the true king of Israel had always been the Lord. Verse 12 makes it clear why the people had asked for a human king. But when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, "No, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king." Their request for a king wasn't born out of a desire to serve God better, but out of fear of their enemies and a wish to be like the other nations. It showed a lack of trust in the Lord as their protector. Yet despite this rejection, God in His mercy still gave them a chance. In verse 13, Samuel says, "Now here is the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you." Then Samuel explains the conditions under which things would go well under the new monarchy. In verse 14 he says, "If you fear the Lord and serve and obey Him, and do not rebel against His commands, if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against His commands, His hand will be against you as it was against your ancestors." Even with a human king, Israel's success or failure would still depend on their obedience to the Lord. King was not a replacement for God. He was merely a human leader who also needed to follow the Lord. To underscore the seriousness of this message, Samuel did something dramatic. Verses 16 to 18 tell us, "Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest? Now I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king." Then Samuel called on the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain. The people all stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. Rain during the wheat harvest was unusual and harmful. It was a clear sign of God's power and a confirmation that Samuel truly spoke on his behalf. The people were terrified and begged Samuel to pray for them, admitting they had sinned by asking for a king. But Samuel didn't want to leave them in despair. In verse 20, he comforts them, "Do not be afraid, you have done all this evil. Yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart." And in verse 22, he reminds them of God's faithfulness for the sake of His great name. The Lord will not reject His people because the Lord was pleased to make you His own. Samuel closed his speech with a promise and a warning. The promise in verse 23 was, "As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you, and I will teach you the way that is good and right," though he would no longer be judge. Samuel would remain God's prophet, praying for the people and teaching them God's ways. The warning in verses 24 and 25 was, "But be sure to fear the faith Lord and serve Him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things He has done for you. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish." And so Samuel stepped down as judge, but not as prophet. One era had ended, and another was beginning. Now the big question was, how would Saul lead the people? In this new chapter, time would tell. Even though he had been anointed and publicly presented as king, Saul still had to prove himself as a military leader. The opportunity came quickly when Nahash, king of the Ammonites, attacked the Israelite city of Jabesh-Gilead. In 11:1 and 2, we read of Nahash's cruelty. Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." It was a brutal condition. Nahash didn't just want to conquer the city. He wanted to humiliate all of Israel. The elders of Jabesh asked for 7 days to seek help. If no one came to rescue them, they would surrender to Nahash's terrible demands. When the messengers reached Gabir, Saul's city, and told the people what was happening, everyone broke down in despair and wept. In verse 5, Saul was returning from the fields with his oxen when he heard the people crying. He asked, "What's wrong with the people? Why are they weeping?" Upon hearing about the situation in Jabes-Gilead, something powerful stirred within Saul. In verse 6 we read, "When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger." Now filled with God's power, Saul took bold, dramatic action to rally all of Israel for war. In verse 7, we see his strategy. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. It was a summons no one could ignore. The message was clear. Anyone who didn't answer the king's call would face serious consequences. And the result stunning. In verse 8, we read that 300,000 men from Israel and 30,000 from Judah responded and assembled at Bezek. Saul then sent this message to the men of Jabesh-Gilead: "By the time the sun is hottest tomorrow, you will be rescued." When the men of Jabesh received that message, they were overjoyed. They told the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do with us whatever you like." This was a clever military ruse. By giving the Ammonites the false impression that Jabesh would surrender the next day, Saul ensured they would lower their guard. The next day, just as planned, Saul divided his army into 3 groups and launched a surprise attack on the Ammonite camp during the last watch of the night. In verse 11, it says, "The next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the Ammonite camp and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. It was a crushing victory. The Ammonites were completely defeated, and the survivors were scattered so thoroughly that not even 2 stayed together. The threat was eliminated, and Jabesh-Gilead was saved from disgrace." This victory changed how the people viewed Saul. He was no longer just the man anointed by Samuel. He had proven himself as a military leader on the battlefield. In verse 12, some said, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring those men here so we can put them to death." They were referring to those who had previously despised Saul, saying, "How can this man save us?" Now they wanted to punish these so-called traitors. But Saul showed not only courage, but also wisdom and generosity. In verse 13, he replied, "No one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." It was a noble response. Instead of seizing the moment to take revenge on those who had doubted him, Saul chose to celebrate the victory that God had given all of Israel. He acknowledged that the deliverance came from the Lord, not from his own strength. Seeing this maturity in Saul, Samuel seized the opportunity to establish the monarchy. In verse 14, he said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship." So the entire nation went to Gilgal and confirmed Saul as king before the Lord. In verse 15 we read, "There at Gilgal they made Saul king in the presence of the Lord, and they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord." Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. It was a solemn ceremony with sacrifices to the Lord and joyful celebration. Now Saul was firmly established as king. Saul had forgotten his humble beginnings. He once saw himself as the least from the least clan of the smallest tribe of Israel. Now as king, he thought he could reinterpret God's commands on his own terms. Saul tries to defend himself in verse 20, "But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I brought back Ag, king of the Amalekites, and I totally destroyed the Amalekites." He insists again in verse 21, "The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God at Gilgal." Once again, Saul shifts the blame to the soldiers and tries to frame disobedience as worship. But Samuel doesn't accept the excuse. In verse 22, he gives a response that echoes through the centuries. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. It's a powerful statement. God isn't interested in religious rituals. If they don't come from a heart of obedience, rebellion against God is likened to witchcraft and arrogance to idolatry. Saul had rejected God's word, and now God rejected Saul as king. Finally, Saul admits his sin in verse 24. I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. But his confession feels shallow, especially when right after asking for forgiveness, he pleads with Samuel to honor him in front of the people's leaders. He still cares more about his image than his relationship with God. Samuel announces the final sentence in verse 28. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to someone better than you. And in verse 29, he adds, He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind. The decision was final. God had rejected Saul as king and chosen another to take his place. From that moment on, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. Though Samuel mourned for him, verse 35, it was a tragic end to what could have been a glorious reign. Saul, Israel's first king, had been chosen and anointed by God, but he failed to obey. His disobedience at Gilgal had shaken his reign. His disobedience regarding the Amalekites sealed it. Now God would seek a man after his own heart to lead his people. The story of Saul teaches us a valuable lesson. God values obedience above all else. It doesn't matter how religious we appear. If we don't obey his word, our actions do not please him. As Samuel said so clearly, to obey is better than sacrifice. Samuel was still mourning for Saul. Despite all the king's disobedience, the old prophet had hoped he would change. But in 1 Samuel 16:1, God speaks directly to Samuel. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. God was ready to move forward. Even if Samuel was still holding on to the past, it was time to seek a new king for Israel, someone with a heart aligned with God's. And that someone was among Jesse's sons, a man from Bethlehem. But there was a problem. Samuel, always cautious, asked, How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. In verse 2, the Lord responds with a plan. Take a hear with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. It was a risky mission. Even though Samuel was God's prophet and respected by the people, Saul was still king and had the power to execute anyone seen as a threat. If Saul found out Samuel was anointing a new king while he was still on the throne, it could be considered treason, a crime punishable by death. The solution was a half-truth. Samuel would go to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice. That was true, but he wouldn't reveal the main reason to anoint a new king. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. In his wisdom, God allowed Samuel to conceal part of the truth to protect himself. Samuel obeyed the Lord and went to Bethlehem. But when he arrived, something unexpected happened. In verse 4 we read, Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, Do you come in peace? Why were the elders trembling at Samuel's arrival? Maybe because an unannounced visit from a prophet often meant trouble, a rebuke for sin, or the announcement of some disaster, or maybe because of the tensions between Samuel and Saul. They didn't want to get caught in the middle of a power struggle. Samuel reassured them, "Yes, in peace I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." In verse 5, he also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. The consecration likely involved washing, putting on clean clothes, and abstaining from certain activities, a spiritual preparation for an encounter with God. It was a common ritual before any sacred event. Samuel's visit caused quite a stir in Bethlehem. A prophet of God didn't just show up every day. People must have wondered why Samuel had chosen their small town to offer a sacrifice, and why he specifically invited Jesse and his sons. But no one knew the real purpose behind the visit. No one except Samuel and God himself. The stage was set for one of the most important moments in Israel's history. The anointing of a new king, a king chosen not for his appearance or strength, but for his heart. When the time for the sacrifice came, Samuel stood before Jesse and his sons. His eyes immediately landed on the eldest, Eliab. He was tall and handsome, much like Saul had been when he was chosen. In his heart, Samuel thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." But in chapter 16-7, the Lord said something to Samuel that would forever change the way he judged people. "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. What a powerful lesson. God doesn't judge as we do. He's not impressed by outward appearance, height, beauty, or physical strength. What truly matters to him is the heart, the thoughts, desires, and deepest motivations. One by one, Jesse's sons were brought before Samuel. After Eliab came Abinadab, then Shammah, and so on. Samuel examined 7 of Jesse's sons, but the Lord said of none of them, "This is the one." Confused, Samuel asked Jesse in verse 11, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse replied, "There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep." It's interesting how Jesse didn't even think to bring his youngest son to the sacrifice. Maybe because he was just a boy, or maybe someone simply had to stay with the sheep. Either way, the young shepherd wasn't considered important enough to be included, but he was exactly the one God had chosen. Samuel said to Jesse, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him. When the boy arrived, verse 12 describes him. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. And the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Without hesitation, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed the young shepherd in the presence of his brothers. Verse 13 tells us what happened next. "And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David." What an extraordinary moment. A young shepherd, the youngest of 8 brothers, anointed as the future king of Israel. And immediately the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, empowering him for the immense task ahead. David's brothers must have been stunned. Why the youngest? Why not one of them? Older, more experienced. But God had his reasons. He had found in David a heart after his own. After the ceremony, Samuel returned to Ramah. The first part of his secret mission was complete. He had anointed Israel's new king, just as God had commanded. Now it was time to wait for God to open the way for David to ascend the throne. David, meanwhile, went back to tending his sheep. Outwardly, nothing had changed. He was still a shepherd. But inwardly, everything was different. The Spirit of God was now upon him, preparing him for his future role. This story shows how God often chooses the unlikely, the small, the seemingly insignificant to carry out his greatest works. He had been anointed privately by Samuel, chosen publicly at Mizpah, and now confirmed at Gilgal after a major military triumph. No one could question his authority or his ability to lead the people into battle. Saul had started well. Filled with the Spirit of God, he showed courage to face the enemy, wisdom in planning the battle, and generosity in forgiving his critics. The people had every reason to celebrate their new king. But despite this strong beginning, it didn't take long for Saul to reveal that not everything was right in his heart. In chapter 13-1, the Bible tells us Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. He was in the prime of life with everything ahead of him. Early in his reign, Saul organized a standing army of 3,000 men. 2,000 stayed with him in Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with his son Jonathan in Geba. The rest of the people were sent home. Jonathan displaying the same bravery as his father attacked and defeated a Philistine outpost at Gabber. Though it was a significant victory, it came with serious consequences. In verse 4 we read, "All Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines." Furious, the Philistines mobilized a massive army in retaliation. In verse 5, we see the scale of the threat. The Philistines assembled to fight. Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Haven. It was a terrifying army. The Israelites realized how grave their situation was. In verse 6, we read how they reacted when the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed. They hid in caves and thicket among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. And in verse 7, some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Fear had spread throughout the Israelite camp. Many were deserting, hiding or fleeing far away. Those who remained with Saul were trembling with fear, as verse 7 states. Saul was in Gilgal, waiting for Samuel as they had agreed. In verse 8 we read, "He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter." The situation was tense. The Philistine army was ready to attack. Israelite soldiers were deserting, and Samuel, who was supposed to come and offer sacrifices and give guidance, appeared to be late. Then Saul made a fatal decision. In verse 9 we read, "So he said, 'Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings.' And Saul offered up the burnt offering. But this was something only priests were authorized to do. As king, Saul had no right to offer sacrifices. He was overstepping into a religious role that wasn't his to take. Right after Saul finished offering the burnt sacrifice, Samuel arrived. In verse 11, Saul tried to justify his actions. "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." Saul gave 3 reasons for his disobedience. The people were scattering. Samuel was late, and the Philistines were about to attack. In other words, the situation called for action, so he acted. It seemed reasonable, but it ignored the fundamental truth that God had given clear commands that were not to be broken, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Samuel's response was blunt and severe. In verse 13 he says, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time." And in verse 14 he adds, "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." What devastating words for Saul to hear. His kingdom would not be established forever. God had already chosen another man, a man after his own heart, to replace him. All because of this single act of disobedience. It might seem like a harsh punishment for what could be seen as a minor mistake, but God sees the heart. This act revealed something deeper about Saul's character. Under pressure, He trusted his own judgment rather than obeying God's word. He chose to do what seemed right in his own eyes instead of waiting on God's timing. After this confrontation, Samuel left Gilgal and went to Giah. Saul counted the men who were still with him. Only 600, a tiny army compared to the Philistine forces. The situation was desperate, and this wouldn't be the last time Saul would be tempted to take matters into his own hands when facing hardship. Despite the harsh rebuke for his disobedience at Gilgal, God still gave Saul another chance to prove his faithfulness. In chapter 15-1, we read, Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. Samuel then delivered a very specific command from God: attack and completely destroy the Amalekites, a people who had attacked Israel when they came out of Egypt. Verse 3 makes the instruction clear. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. It was a difficult command, but an unambiguous one. The Amalekites and everything they had were to be wiped out. Nothing was to be spared. Saul mobilized his army, 200,000 feet soldiers from Israel and 10,000 from Judah. As he approached the Amalekite city, he was careful to warn the Kenites who lived among them to move away. The Kenites were descendants of Moses' father-in-law and had shown kindness to Israel in the past. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites and defeated them thoroughly from Havilah to Shur, near the Egyptian border. But here's the problem. In verse 9 we read, But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat, calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. This was clear disobedience to God's command. Saul was supposed to destroy everything, but he chose to spare King Ag and the best of the livestock. Maybe he thought Ag would be a valuable prisoner of war, a trophy of victory, and the animals. It probably felt like a waste to destroy what could be useful. God's response was immediate. In verse 10 we read, Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Samuel was deeply disturbed. He had anointed Saul as Israel's first king, and now Saul had failed again. He spent the entire night crying out to the Lord, perhaps interceding for Saul, perhaps seeking strength for the confrontation he knew was coming. The next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. When he arrived, Saul greeted him confidently. The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. What self-deception! Saul truly believed he had obeyed, even though he had spared Agag and the best animals. But Samuel wasn't fooled. In verse 14 he asks, What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Saul's response in verse 15 reveals his mindset. The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Notice how Saul tries to dodge responsibility. The soldiers brought them as if it wasn't his decision, and he tries to make his disobedience sound like devotion to sacrifice them to the Lord. But God hadn't asked for sacrifices. He had commanded complete destruction. Samuel cuts Saul off and says, Enough. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. When Saul asks him to speak, Samuel delivers a piercing question. Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the Lord's sight? That question strikes at the heart of the issue. The book of Acts in the New Testament acknowledges this legacy. In chapter 3:24, Peter says, "Indeed, beginning with Samuel, all the prophets who have spoken have foretold these days." Samuel is seen as the beginning of a prophetic line that pointed to the coming of the Messiah. The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews also honors Samuel, placing him alongside figures like Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David as examples of faith. But perhaps Samuel's greatest legacy was his influence on David. It was Samuel who anointed the young shepherd boy, recognizing him as God's chosen one to lead Israel. It was Samuel who provided refuge to David when he was fleeing from Saul. And it was likely Samuel who helped David understand that despite the persecution he faced, God still had a plan for his life. The impact of this guidance can be seen in David's Psalms, which express deep trust in God even in the hardest of circumstances. That kind of faith, shaped in part by Samuel's influence, would become a defining trait of David's reign. A reign remembered as that of a man after God's own heart. With Samuel's death, a chapter in Israel's history came to a close. But his life and ministry paved the way for a new era, the era of kings and prophets, which would continue to shape Israel's story for centuries to come. And so this extraordinary man who began life as a miracle granted to a praying mother and became one of Israel's greatest leaders finished his journey. As Hebrews 11 hours 39 minutes and 40 seconds says, "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." Dear friend who has followed this journey through the life of Samuel, the last judge of Israel, we've come to the end of this incredible biblical story. We've seen how God worked through a boy born from a desperate prayer and raised him into one of the greatest leaders Israel has ever known. We followed Samuel from his childhood in the tabernacle, through his nighttime calling, his establishment as a prophet, the transition to monarchy, all the way to the final moments of his life when he protected young David from Saul's wrath. If this story of faith, courage, and faithfulness has inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with friends and family who also need to hear how God can use ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Subscribe to our channel to discover more Bible stories told in this dynamic and engaging way. Every week we bring a new narrative from Scripture to strengthen your faith and deepen your knowledge of the Word. Click the subscribe button now. Turn on notifications and give this video a like. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories with more people. Thank you so much for watching. May Samuel's story inspire your walk with God today. If the story of Samuel touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life-changing Bible journeys. Share this message of faith and purpose with someone who needs encouragement. Today, together, let's bring these powerful stories to more hearts. As Goliath advanced to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, he took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. So in verse 50 we read, David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. To complete his victory, David ran over and stood above the Philistine. He took Goliath's own sword, drew it from its sheath, and killed him, cutting off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The Israelites, now emboldened, chased them down and defeated them. This extraordinary victory marked the beginning of David's military career. From a humble shepherd boy, he became a national hero, all because he trusted in the Lord and had the courage to face a seemingly impossible challenge. David's victory over Goliath instantly made him a national hero. When the army returned from battle, something unprecedented happened. In chapter 18-6 we read, When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lyres. It was a grand celebration full of music and dancing. But the lyrics of the women's song sparked a dangerous fire in the king's heart. In verse 7, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." Imagine how those words must have hit Saul. He was the king, the chosen one, the anointed leader of Israel. And now this young shepherd he had brought in to play the harp was receiving more praise than he was. Verse 8 captures his reaction. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. "They have credited David with tens of thousands," he thought, "but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" Saul realized that David could become a threat to his throne. Not only did the people love David more, but he was also achieving greater success on the battlefield. And the most terrifying thing for Saul, from that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Jealousy is a powerful and destructive emotion. In Saul's case, it soon turned into a deadly obsession. In verse 9 we read, "Saul kept a jealous eye on David, and the very next day, things took a dark turn." Verse 10 says, "The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand. What should have been a healing moment through music became a moment of danger. As David played, trying to soothe the troubled king, Saul was plotting his murder." Verse 11 describes Saul's first attempt on David's life. "And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, 'I'll pin David to the wall.' But David eluded him twice. David narrowly escaped. In his impulsive rage, Saul tried to kill him in front of witnesses, not even attempting to hide his intentions. But his attempt failed, and David, quick and agile, managed to dodge the spears. The failure only deepened Saul's fear. Verse 12 reads, "Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul." He was witnessing his worst nightmare unfold. God's favor, once his, was now clearly with David. To get David out of his sight, Saul gave him command over 1,000 men. In verse 13 we read, "So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns." But this plan backfired. Instead of weakening David's popularity, it only made him more beloved. Verse 14 says, "In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him." And verse 16 adds, "But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns." Realizing that removing David from court wasn't working, Saul tried a new tactic. He offered his daughter Michal to David in marriage, but with a deadly bride price. In verse 25 Saul said, "Tell David that the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." The Bible explains, Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. Saul hoped David would die trying to collect those Philistine foreskins, but once again, his plan failed. In verse 27 we read, "David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter, Michal. In marriage, instead of bringing back 100, David returned with 200. He not only survived, but exceeded expectations." Verse 29 sums it up. Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. The tension between the two men continued to grow. On one side, David, the young warrior, loved by the people and successful in all he did because the Lord was with him. On the other, Saul, a king increasingly burdened by his crown, consumed by jealousy and fear, abandoned by the Spirit of the Lord, and tormented by an evil one. The stage was set for an ever-escalating conflict. one that would force David to choose between remaining loyal to a king who wanted him dead or fleeing for his life. Saul's obsession with killing David only intensified. In chapter 19:1 we read, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. The situation had escalated from impulsive outbursts to a calculated murder plot. But Saul hadn't counted on the deep friendship that had developed between his son Jonathan and David. Instead of obeying his father's command, Jonathan warned David. In verse 2 he says, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there." Jonathan promised to speak to his father about David and then report back with whatever he found out. He passionately defended David, reminding Saul how David had risked his life to kill Goliath and how that victory had brought a great deliverance to Israel. In verse 6, Saul was persuaded by Jonathan's defense and swore, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." Jonathan relayed the conversation to David, and David returned to serve in the royal court as before. But the peace didn't last. When Israel went to war again, David fought the Philistines and won a decisive victory. This reignited Saul's jealousy. In verse 9 we read, "But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him. As Saul drove the spear into the wall that night, David fled and escaped. This time, David didn't return to the court. It was clear the truce was over and Saul was fully intent on killing him. David fled to his house, but Saul didn't give up. He sent men to watch David's home and kill him in the morning. Michal, David's wife, and Saul's daughter warned him, "If you don't escape tonight, you'll be dead by morning." She helped David slip out through a window and he fled to safety. To buy time, Michal devised a clever trick. She took a household idol, a human-shaped statue, laid it in David's bed, covered it with clothes, and placed goat's hair at the head to resemble him. When Saul's men came to get David, Michal told them he was sick. Saul ordered, "Bring him to me in his bed so I may kill him." But when they entered, they found only the idol in the bed. Saul was furious with his daughter. In verse 17, he asked her, "Why did you betray me like this and let my enemy escape?" Michal replied, "He said to me, 'Help me get away or I'll kill you,' and lie to protect both David and herself from Saul's rage." Meanwhile, David had fled to Ramah where Samuel lived. In verse 18 we read, "When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Neath and stayed there." This was a significant moment. In his time of greatest danger, David turned to the man who had anointed him as Israel's future king. To David, Samuel represented spiritual guidance, someone who understood God's purpose for his life. In youth, likely a kind of prophetic community near Ramah, David found temporary refuge. But Saul soon found out where David was. In verse 19, word came to Saul, "David is in youth at Ramah," so he sent men to capture him. But something extraordinary happened. When Saul's messengers arrived and saw a group of prophets prophesying, led by Samuel, the Spirit of God came upon them, and they too began to prophesy. Saul sent 2 more groups of men, and the same thing happened to each. Finally, in verse 22, Saul himself went to Ramah, on the way to Siku. He asked where Samuel and David were and continued on to Nith. As the Apostle Paul would say centuries later, God chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. While the Spirit of the Lord came upon David, something terrible was happening to Saul. In verse 14 we read, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him." What a contrast! David receiving the Spirit, Saul losing it. It was as if a spiritual transfer had occurred from the rejected king to the chosen one. And in the absence of the Lord's Spirit, an evil spirit came to torment Saul, Saul's attendants. Notice the change in his behavior. He was restless, troubled, perhaps even violent at times. In verse 15, they said, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you." Then they offered a solution in verse 16. "Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." Saul agreed and said, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants remembered someone. "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man. And the Lord is with him." Isn't it amazing how God works? The very man Saul was seeking to soothe his tormented spirit was the same young man Samuel had just anointed as the next king. God was paving the way for David to enter the royal court. Saul sent messengers to Jesse, saying in verse 19, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." Jesse prepared a gift for the king, a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent his son David with them to Saul. When David arrived, Saul took a liking to him. In verse 21, we read, "David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor-bearers." Saul had no idea that this young man had been anointed to replace him as king. Saul was so pleased with David that he sent word to Jesse saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." And so David began to play the harp for Saul whenever the evil spirit came upon him. In verse 23, we see the result. Whenever the spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his harp and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better and the evil spirit would leave him. David's music had a therapeutic effect on Saul. The sweet sounds of the harp soothed his troubled mind and temporarily drove away the evil spirit. It was as if David was ministering to Saul, even without realizing that he would one day take his place. This story reminds us of the power of music to heal and bring comfort. It also shows how God can use the talents he gives us to open doors, sometimes even doors to royal palaces. At this point, David was established in Saul's court, serving as both a musician and armor-bearer. But his greatest test was still ahead. The Philistines, longtime enemies of Israel, had assembled their armies for war. In chapter 17-1, we read, "The Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Su in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephesus Dammim between Su and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites also gathered and camped in the valley of ready to face the Philistines. The two armies were stationed on opposite hills with the valley between them." That's when a terrifying figure emerged from the Philistine side. In verse 4, the Bible describes him. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. Goliath was a giant, not just in size, but in weaponry as well. He wore a bronze helmet and a coat of scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. He had bronze greaves on his legs, and his spear's iron point alone weighed 15 pounds. He was a human war machine built to terrify, and terrify he did. Every day for 40 days straight, Goliath would come out and challenge the Israelite army. In verse 8, he shouted, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." This was a call for single combat, a common practice at the time. Instead of full-scale battle, each side could send a champion to determine the outcome. But who in Israel had the courage to face this mountain of a man? In verse 11, we see their reaction. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Even King Saul himself, who should have been leading by example, was shaken. For 40 days, the Israelite army lived under a shadow of fear. It was at this critical moment that David entered the scene. He wasn't with the army. He had returned to Bethlehem to tend his father's sheep. His 3 oldest brothers were with Saul at the battlefield. One day, Jesse sent David with food for his brothers and told him to check on their well-being. David obeyed. In verse 20 we read, "Early in the morning, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. David left his supplies with the keeper of the provisions and ran to greet his brothers. While they were talking, Goliath came out and issued his usual challenge. The Israelites once again fled in fear. David was puzzled. In verse 26, he asked, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" To David, this wasn't just an insult to Israel. It was an affront to God himself. Eliab, David's oldest brother, got angry at his questioning. In verse 28, he scolded David, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Eliab's words dripped with jealousy and contempt for his younger brother. Perhaps he still resented that Samuel had chosen David over him. But David didn't let that stop him. He simply replied, "Now, what have I done? Can't I even speak?" And he kept asking about Goliath. When Saul heard that someone was asking questions about the giant, he sent for him. To his surprise, it was David, his musician. In verse 32, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul was baffled. How could this young man possibly face the giant? Verse 33, he replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David had experience that Saul didn't know about. In verses 34-37, he explained, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." What amazing faith! David wasn't relying on his own strength, but on the Lord who had already delivered him before. To him, Goliath was no greater threat than a lion or a bear. More importantly, Goliath had defied the living God, and that could not go unanswered. Faced with such unwavering confidence, Saul relented. "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul tried to outfit David with his own armor, but it was too big and clumsy. In verse 39, David said, "I cannot go in these because I am not used to them." Instead, he took his staff, chose 5 smooth stones from a stream, placed them in his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand, approached the Philistine. When Goliath saw David, he was furious. In verse 43 he said, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And he cursed David by his gods, but David stood firm. In verse 45 he replied with boldness, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And he made a bold declaration, "This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Then in verse 23, something even more astonishing happened. "So Saul went to Naat Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Nah. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night." This is why people say, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" This was the second time people had asked that question about Saul, the first being shortly after his anointing when the Spirit of God came upon him and he prophesied among the prophets. It was as if God were reminding Saul of his original calling before jealousy and fear consumed him. This supernatural event gave David the time he needed to escape. He fled from youth and went to find Jonathan. In chapter 20, they made a plan to find out once and for all if Saul was truly determined to kill David. Once that became clear, especially when Saul even hurled a spear at his own son for defending David, Jonathan warned David to flee. This marked the beginning of years of running for David. He went to Nob, where he received bread and Goliath's sword from the priest, Ahimelech. Then he fled to Gath in Philistine territory, where he pretended to be insane to avoid being recognized as the giant slayer. From there he escaped to the cave of Adullam, where he began to attract followers. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. From Adullam, David took his parents to Moab for their safety, then returned to Judah, hiding in the forest of Herth. Meanwhile, Saul discovered the priests of Nob had helped David, and in a rage killed 85 priests and destroyed the entire town. The pursuit continued with Saul chasing David through the wilderness, from one hideout to another. Twice David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he spared him, saying, "I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed." During all this time, Samuel is no longer mentioned. After helping David at Nuth, the old prophet seems to have stepped out of the narrative, perhaps due to old age. But his impact on David's life was deep and enduring. The moment David fled to Ramah to seek out Samuel was a turning point in his life. He was leaving behind the security of the court, his marriage to Michal, his friendship with Jonathan, and his position as a military commander, all because Saul was determined to kill him. Samuel listened as David recounted Saul's attempts on his life. As an experienced prophet, Samuel must have understood that this persecution was part of God's plan to shape David's character. Yet, it didn't stop him from offering the young anointed one shelter and support. In chapter 19, verse 18, we read, David fled and escaped. He went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Nuth and stayed there. Nuth was likely a kind of school for prophets. As a spiritual leader, Samuel had established communities where young men were trained in the scriptures and in prophetic ministry. It was a place of spiritual learning and deep communion with God. By taking David to Nuth, Samuel was placing him in an environment of intense spiritual life. Surrounded by prophets, David could find not only physical protection, but also spiritual renewal. That may have been exactly what he needed after the tensions he had experienced at Saul's court. But the safety didn't last long. In verse 19, we read, when Saul was told, David is at Nuth in Ramah, he sent men to capture him. What happened next was extraordinary. In verse 20, the Bible says, but when they saw a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also began to prophesy. Imagine the scene. Armed soldiers sent to arrest David, suddenly dropping their weapons and starting to prophesy. It was a direct divine intervention to protect David. When Saul heard what happened, he sent more messengers. But the same thing happened. He sent a third group. And again, they were all overcome and began to prophesy. Finally, in verse 22, we read, Saul himself went to Ramah. As he approached Ramah, he asked where Samuel and David were. Following the directions, he continued toward Nith. But in verse 23, something surprising occurred. The Spirit of God came upon him too, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Nuth. And verse 24 adds even more surprising detail. He stripped off his garments and prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay that way all day and all night. That is why people say, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" What an unusual scene. The king of Israel who had come to kill David now lying on the ground, stripped of his royal garments, caught in a prophetic trance for an entire day and night. No wonder the people asked that ironic question, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" This wasn't the first time that phrase had been used about Saul. Back in chapter 10, after he was anointed by Samuel, the Spirit of God came upon him and he prophesied among the prophets, causing people to say the very same words. Now years later, it happened again, but under very different circumstances. The first time it was a sign that God was with Saul, equipping him to lead Israel. This time it seemed more like an obstacle, a way of protecting David by temporarily incapacitating Saul. Samuel, as the leader of the prophets, witnessed all of this. He saw how God was protecting David, the man he had anointed to be the future king. And perhaps he also felt sorrow for Saul, seeing just how far the king had fallen. For David, this incident must have been a powerful confirmation that God was with him, even when the king of Israel with all his resources came personally to capture him. God could intervene in miraculous ways to keep him safe. Although the Bible doesn't mention it directly, it's possible that during this time in youth, under Samuel's guidance, David composed some of his psalms. Many of them speak about trusting God during times of persecution and hardship. And this encounter in youth surely strengthened that trust. This was the last recorded meeting between Samuel and David, and one of Samuel's final acts of ministry. The old prophet who had anointed both Saul and David had fulfilled his role in God's plan. Soon he would be called to his eternal rest. In chapter 25-1, we read the simple yet profound words, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah." Samuel, who had served God in Israel since his boyhood, was finally called home. His death marked the end of an era. He was the last of the judges, the kind of leader who had guided Israel since the days of Joshua. And he was also the first of the great prophets who would rise in Israel and Judah in the centuries to come. The fact that all Israel assembled and mourned for him shows the deep respect and love the people had for Samuel. He had been a constant presence in their lives, a moral and spiritual authority who had led them through a turbulent time of transition. As a judge, Samuel traveled the country every year, settling disputes and maintaining justice. Unlike his own sons, he never accepted bribes or perverted justice. In his farewell speech as judge, he challenged the people to point out anyone he had cheated or oppressed, and no one could. As a prophet, Samuel was the voice of God to the people. It was through him that God spoke to establish the monarchy, to reject Saul, and to choose David. His words never failed. Everything he prophesied came to pass because the Lord was with him. As a priest, Samuel had ministered before the Lord. From childhood under Eli's training, he offered sacrifices, interceded for the people, and taught them the ways of the Lord. Few figures in Israel's history combined these three roles: judge, prophet, and priest like Samuel did. Perhaps only Moses before him. And like Moses, Samuel was a transitional leader guiding Israel from one form of government, the judges, to another, the monarchy. Samuel did not live to see David take the throne. After his death, David moved to the wilderness of Pan, continuing his life as a fugitive. Saul's pursuit would go on for a while longer until the final battle against the Philistines, where Saul and Jonathan would die, paving the way for David to become king. But even without seeing the fulfillment of everything he had prophesied. Samuel left this world with the satisfaction of having been faithful to his calling. From the moment he answered as a boy, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," to his final days, Samuel served the Lord with integrity. His legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. The prophets who came after him, Nathan, Gad, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and many others, followed his example of boldly proclaiming God's truth, even when it meant confronting kings,